"Are you deaf, old man?" I said. "Move it." The voice, sharp and serrated, cut through the quiet hum of the Marine Corps training facility. Sal DiMarco didn't flinch. At 79, he'd learned that the loudest voices were often the least threatening. He continued his work, guiding the wet mop in slow, overlapping arcs across the polished concrete floor. The scent of industrial cleaner and pine rose from the freshly mopped surface, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Brady, a man carved from granite and impatience. He stood with 3 other Force Recon Marines, all of them radiating the restless, predatory energy of caged predators. They were young, their muscles coiled like springs under their tight PT shirts, their faces holding the arrogant certainty that the world was something to be conquered, not endured. "I've got a briefing in 10 minutes, and you're polishing this floor like it's the Sistine Chapel," Brady snapped, taking a step closer. His boots, spotless and black, stopped just shy of the wet floor, a small island of defiance in Sal's sea of clean work. "This is a classified training facility, not a shopping mall. Get your bucket and go." Sal finished his arc, his movements unhurried and economical. He straightened his back, a slow creaking process that seemed to annoy Brady even further. Sal's eyes, a faded brown like old leather, met the staff sergeant's. They were calm, observant, and held a depth that Brady mistook for senility. "Almost done, son," Sal said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp colored with the accent of South Philadelphia. It wasn't defiant, merely factual. "I'm not your son," Brady sneered. The other 3 Marines chuckled, a low rumble of pack animal amusement. "I'm the guy telling you to get out of the way, now." The confrontation had drawn a small audience. A few other Marines, fresh from morning PT, lingered near the equipment lockers, pretending to sort their gear while their eyes flickered toward the scene unfolding in the central corridor. This was Brady's domain, and the old janitor had trespassed on his authority. Brady was a star in the brutal constellation of force reconnaissance training. He was faster, stronger, and meaner than almost anyone else in his unit. He thrived on the punishment, on the instructors screaming, on the frigid shock of amphibious operation. He saw the world as a hierarchy of strength, and the stooped, frail man with a mop was at the absolute bottom, an obstacle, a ghost who haunted the edges of their elite world, smelling of disinfectant and irrelevant. "You know," Brady said, circling Sal slowly, "I don't think you should be in here at all. This is a secure area. We have classified equipment, sensitive training protocols. What's to stop you from being some kind of spy, listening in, taking pictures?" Sal leaned on his mop, his gnarled hands resting on the worn wooden handle. "I have clearance." They checked, Brady scoffed, stopping directly in front of Sal, forcing the old man to crane his neck to look up at him. "You look like you couldn't remember your own address. Let me see some ID." The demand hung in the air like a deliberate escalation. A janitor didn't get asked for ID by a staff sergeant. It was a power play, a public humiliation designed to establish dominance. Sal's gaze didn't waver. He simply reached into the pocket of his blue coveralls and pulled out a worn, cracked leather wallet. His movements were steady, betraying no anger or fear. He was an island of calm in a sea of simmering testosterone. He fumbled for a moment with the plastic sleeve, his arthritic fingers struggling with the task. Brady let out an exaggerated sigh. "Any day now, Grandpa. We've got a war to train for." Finally, Sal slid out his base access identification card and held it out. Brady snatched it from his hand, glanced at it, then back at Sal, a smirk playing on his lips. "Salvatore DiMarco," he read aloud. "Well, Salvatore DiMarco, your picture looks like it was taken when Eisenhower was president." He didn't return the card. Instead, his eyes drifted down to the collar of Sal's coveralls. Pinned there was a small, tarnished piece of metal. It was nondescript, barely larger than a dime, with no discernible mark. From a distance it looked like a piece of junk, something found in a gutter and pinned on for no reason. Brady reached out and flicked it with his finger. "What's this?" "Your 20-year service pin from the janitorial union." The moment his finger touched the metal, the world shifted for Sal. It wasn't a full memory, just a flash of sensations, a ghost of a life lived decades ago. The suffocating wet heat of a Mekong Delta rice paddy, the metallic tang of blood in his mouth, the rhythmic thumping of Huey rotor blades cutting through thick, humid air, the weight of a wounded teammate slung across his shoulders, the whisper of a dying man's last words against his ear, the glint of that same piece of metal, not tarnished then, but new and gleaming. A fragment from the first grenade he'd ever thrown in anger, pressed into his palm by a captain who said, "Keep this, DiMarco. Remember what it caught." It was over in a second, a phantom limb of a past he never spoke of. He blinked, and the fluorescent lights of the training facility returned, bright and sterile. He was just an old man leaning on a mop from an observation room overlooking the main floor. Colonel Patricia Reeves watched the scene unfold through reinforced glass. Reeves was a living legend in Marine Force reconnaissance, a woman who had broken barriers and earned respect through 3 decades of exceptional service. She had a face that showed every hard-won lesson from combat zones across 2 continents, and eyes that missed nothing. She had seen Brady's type before, strong, capable, but with an arrogance that was a liability. But it wasn't Brady's bullying that held her attention. It was the janitor. Colonel Reeves saw something in the old man's stillness that made her lean forward against the glass. It was the utter lack of fear or indignation, a profound and unsettling calm that she had only seen in operators who had walked through the very worst of combat and emerged, made of something harder than flesh and bone. She watched as Brady flicked the pin on the old man's collar, and something about the gesture triggered a memory from her own past. 20 years ago, as a young lieutenant, she had attended a classified briefing about Vietnam-era special operations. There had been whispered stories about operators so deep in black programs that their names appeared in no official records. One story in particular had stuck with her, about a Marine reconnaissance team that had operated in areas that officially didn't exist, conducting missions that were never acknowledged. The team leader had been a staff sergeant from Philadelphia, who had earned a reputation for bringing his people home against impossible odds. Colonel Reeves squinted at the man on the floor below, studying his posture, his bearing, the way he held himself despite his age. Something clicked in her memory, a photograph in that old briefing, grainy and partially redacted, showing a young Marine with the same weathered features and steady eyes. She pulled out her secure phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. The call was answered on the second ring. Marine Corps Historical Division. "This is Sergeant Major Williams." "Williams, this is Colonel Reeves at Quantico. I need you to run a name through the classified archives. Vietnam era, Force Recon, possible SOG connection." "Ma'am, you know I can't access those files without proper authorization. The name is Salvatore DiMarco. Enlisted around 9. And Williams, this is Priority 1. There was a pause, then the sound of rapid typing. When Williams spoke again, his voice had changed completely. "Ma'am, where are you right now?" "Training Facility Alpha, observing floor." "Why?" "Ma'am, do not let that man leave. Do not let anyone interfere with him. I'm making some calls right now." The line went dead, leaving Colonel Reeves with a growing sense that she was witnessing something historically significant. Back on the main floor, Brady was pushing his advantage to its breaking point. Sal's silence was infuriating him, making him feel oddly powerless despite his physical dominance. "That's it. I'm done with this," Brady declared, puffing out his chest. He reached out and grabbed Sal's thin arms, surprised by the surprising hardness of the muscle beneath the loose fabric. "You're coming with me. We're going to have a nice long chat with base security about what a confused old man is doing in a classified facility." He started to pull Sal toward the main door. It was the ultimate act of hubris, the final step over a line he didn't even know existed. But Sal did not move. Brady pulled, but the old man was an anchor, his worn boots seemingly fused to the concrete floor. Just as Brady was about to use more force, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the tension outside. The sound started as a low rumble and grew rapidly into the squeal of tires on asphalt. It wasn't the sound of a single security patrol, it was the sound of a convoy moving at emergency speed. Through the large windows of the training facility, the Marines could see black SUVs with government plates and small flags mounted on their front fenders, screeching to a halt. Flanked by Marine patrol vehicles with flashing lights, doors flew open with military precision. The base commanding officer, a general known for his stern demeanor, practically fell out of the lead SUV, his face ashen with urgency. He was followed by a detail of Marines in dress blue uniforms, who immediately formed a security perimeter around the facility. From the rear door of the second SUV emerged a figure that made every Marine in the building straighten, unconsciously. It was General Marcus Stone, a 3-star general who commanded all East Coast Marine operations. He was a man whose presence at a training facility was as shocking as lightning on a clear day. The facility's main doors burst open with such force they banged against the walls. The commanding officer rushed in, his eyes wide with something approaching panic. He saw the scene, his Staff Sergeant holding an elderly janitor by the arm, and a look of pure horror crossed his face. "Brady," he barked, "release that man immediately and stand at attention." Brady, utterly bewildered, dropped Sal's arm as if it were red hot. He and every other Marine in the room snapped to perfect attention, their backs ramrod straight, their eyes locked forward. General Stone strode into the facility, his presence seeming to suck all the air from the room. He was followed by Colonel Reeves, who had descended from the observation deck with an expression of grim satisfaction. The general's eyes, cold and furious, swept over the terrified Marines, over the panicked base commander, and finally landed on Brady. He looked at the young powerful Force Recon Marine as if he were something distasteful on his shoe. But he didn't speak to him. Instead, he walked past Brady, past everyone else, and came to a stop directly in front of the stooped janitor in blue coverall. Sal simply watched him approach, his expression unchanged, as if 3-star generals appeared in front of him every day. The facility was utterly silent except for the distant hum of the idling vehicles outside and the frantic beating of 24 hearts. Then the impossible happened. General Marcus Stone, commander of tens of thousands of Marines, brought his heels together with a sharp click on the concrete floor. He raised his hand to his brow in a salute so crisp, so perfect, it seemed to cut the air. "Staff Sergeant DiMarco," the general's voice boomed, filled with a respect that bordered on reverence. "It is an honor to be in your presence, sir." Brady's jaw went slack. The other Marines stared in stunned disbelief. They were witnessing a fundamental break in the laws of their universe. A 3-star general was saluting a janitor. Sal slowly, almost tiredly, raised his hand and gave a slight nod. It wasn't a return salute, but an acknowledgement, an acceptance from one warrior to another across the decade. General Stone held his salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. He then turned to face the assembled Marines, his gaze sweeping over their shocked faces, until it locked onto Brady. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Brady, pale and trembling, could only shake his head. "No, sir. No, you don't," the general continued, his voice rising with controlled fury. "You see an old man, a janitor, someone in your way. You are training to be America's elite warriors, but you have no concept of the shoulders you stand on." He gestured toward Sal. "This is Staff Sergeant Salvatore DiMarco, United States Marine Corps. In 1967, he was attached to a highly classified unit conducting cross-border operations in Southeast Asia. He was running deep reconnaissance into areas where we officially had no personnel, when most of your fathers weren't even born." A murmur went through the room. Cross-border operations were the stuff of legend, missions so classified they existed only in whispered stories. This man, the general said, his voice now ringing with terrible clarity, was part of a 4-man team inserted into the A Shau Valley to gather intelligence on enemy supply routes. They were compromised and surrounded by a full battalion of North Vietnamese regulars, over 400 enemy soldiers against 4 Marines. The general took a step toward Brady, who looked as if he might collapse. For 3 days and 3 nights, they held their position. Staff Sergeant DiMarco, armed with nothing but his rifle and a handful of grenades, personally directed airstrikes so close that he was burned by napalm and deafened by the explosions. He pointed directly at Brady's chest. When his team leader was killed, he took command. When their radio operator was hit, he called in extraction while laying down covering fire with one hand. When they ran out of ammunition, he used captured enemy weapons. By the time the helicopters could reach them, only DiMarco and 1 other Marine were still alive. The general's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "The small unit tactics you think are so modern, the reconnaissance techniques you're learning in this facility, men like Staff Sergeant DiMarco wrote that doc. They wrote it in blood, in mud, in places that don't appear on any official maps." He turned his gaze to the small tarnished pin on Sal's collar. "That piece of metal you mocked isn't from any Union. It's a fragment from the first grenade he used to break an enemy ambush 56 years ago. A reminder of a day when 4 Marines held off an entire battalion and lived to tell about it." The silence in the room was now absolute, heavy with shame and awe. Every eye was on Sal, who looked not like a hero, but like a man profoundly tired, a man who had carried the weight of that valley for more than half a century. General Stone turned back to Brady, his expression carved from ice. "Staff Sergeant Brady, hand Mr. DiMarco your weapon." Brady fumbled with his M4 carbine, his hands shaking so badly, he could barely work the sling. He held the weapon out with trembling arms, Present it to Staff Sergeant DiMarco, the general commanded. Brady obeyed, stepping forward on unsteady legs to offer the rifle to the elderly janitor. The moment Sal's hands touched the modern weapon, a transformation occurred that was subtle but total. The weary stoop in his shoulders vanished, his back straightened to perfect military bearing. The 79-year-old janitor seemed to disappear, replaced by something harder, more focused. His hands, which had trembled slightly while fumbling with his wallet, were now rock steady. They moved with innate, terrifying familiarity over the rifle's controls. His grip was perfect, his trigger discipline flawless. He brought the weapon up to his shoulder in a single fluid motion, his eye aligning perfectly with the optic. He checked the chamber, tested the selector switch, and examined the weapon with an economy of movement that spoke of decades of muscle memory. He did it all in less than 3 seconds. It was a display of competence and purpose that no amount of modern training could replicate. It was instinct forged in the crucible of actual combat. For just a moment, he held the rifle as if scanning for threats, his gaze sweeping over the Marines with an intensity that made them feel like targets in someone else's crosshairs. Then, with the same fluid efficiency, he made the weapon safe and handed it back to Brady. The demonstration lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it contained more education about warfare than most of the Marines had received in months of training. General Stone let the lesson sink in before speaking again. Staff Sergeant Brady, you stand on the shoulders of giants, and today you were spitting on the man who helped build the very foundation you stand on. He turned to Sal, his expression softening completely. Staff Sergeant DiMarco, is there anything we can do for you? Anything you need? Sal looked at the general, at the terrified young Marines, at the mop and bucket sitting abandoned on the wet floor. He gave a small, sad smile. The uniform changes, General, he said, his gravelly voice filling the silent room. The mission doesn't. These boys are learning to be warriors. That's good work, important work. He looked directly at Brady, not with anger, but with something approaching pity. The young man's just got fire in him. Fire's good. It's what keeps you alive when everything else fails. He just needs to learn the difference between being strong and being cruel. As he spoke, a final memory surfaced clearly in Sal's mind. He was back in that valley, cradling his dying team leader, a captain from Boston named Murphy. With his last breath, Murphy had pressed that small piece of grenade fragment into Sal's palm and whispered, "Don't let them forget us, DiMarco. Don't let them forget what it costs." Sal had kept that promise for 56 years. The fallout was swift and decisive. Staff Sergeant Brady was not kicked out of force reconnaissance. General Stone, in a moment of wisdom, decided that would be too easy. Instead, Brady was recycled back to the beginning of the program, forced to start over under the watchful eyes of instructors who now knew exactly what kind of character adjustment he needed. For the institution, the change was more significant. General Stone mandated a new addition to the Force Recon curriculum, a mandatory history course, focusing on the origins of Marine Special Operations and the classified units that had paved the way for modern forces. The first lecture was titled simply, "The Legacy of the Valley Warriors," and it was taught by Colonel Reeves herself. An enlarged photograph of a young Staff Sergeant DiMarco in Vietnam fatigues was hung in the main corridor of the training facility, a permanent reminder to every Marine of the history they were inheriting. The base offered Sal a formal commendation and a significant pension increase, which he quietly accepted but didn't make a big deal about. The next day, he was back at the facility with his mop and bucket, the floors gleaming under his slow, steady care. His presence, however, had fundamentally changed. He was no longer an invisible old man. The Marines spoke to him with quiet, reverent respect. They held doors for him, asked if he needed help with his equipment, and listened intently when he occasionally shared a story or piece of advice. They saw him not as a janitor, but as a living piece of Marine Corps history. 3 weeks later, a much-changed Brady, now a private first class again, gaunt and humbled from restarting the brutal training program, saw Sal eating alone in the facility's small break room during the lunch hour. After a long moment of hesitation, Brady approached the table where the old man sat with his simple sandwich and thermos of coffee. "Staff Sergeant DiMarco," Brady said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, could you tell me about Captain Murphy?" Sal looked up from his meal, studying the young Marine's face. He saw the shame there, but also a flicker of genuine curiosity, a desire to understand something larger than himself. The arrogance had been scoured away by weeks of punishing training, leaving behind something potentially worth developing. Sal gave a slow nod and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, son," he said gently. "Let me tell you about a real leader." For the next hour, in the quiet of that break room, a living legend shared stories that would never appear in any official history book. Stories about courage that had nothing to do with physical strength, about leadership that came from putting others first, about the difference between being a warrior and being a bully. By the end of their conversation, Brady understood that he had been given a gift more valuable than any medal or commendation, the chance to learn from someone who had lived the values he was only beginning to understand. Over the following months, something remarkable happened at the Marine Corps training facility. What had begun as a single conversation between Sal and Brady evolved into an unofficial but profound educational program. Young Marines began seeking out the elderly janitor during their breaks, not for entertainment but for wisdom. They would find him during his quiet moments, eating lunch alone, taking a break from mopping, sitting on a bench outside the facility, and ask questions that their instructors couldn't answer. Staff Sergeant DiMarco, a young corporal named Jensen, asked one afternoon, "How do you know when you're ready for combat?" Sal paused in cleaning his mop, considering the question with the same seriousness he gave to every inquiry. "Son, you're never really ready. Combat isn't something you prepare for like a test. It's something you survive by remembering your training and taking care of your teammates." He wrung out the mop with methodical precision. "The biggest mistake young Marines make is thinking being tough means being hard. Being tough means staying soft enough to care about the man next to you, even when everything's falling apart." Another Marine, Private Lou, approached during one of these impromptu sessions. "Sir, what was the scariest moment you ever?" Sal was quiet for a long time, his weathered hands still on the mop handle. "The scariest moment wasn't getting shot at, son. It was the first time I had to tell a mother that her boy wasn't coming home. That's when you learn what real courage looks like, facing someone's worst day and still finding words of comfort." These conversations became legendary among the Marines in training. They began to understand that warfare wasn't just about physical capability or advanced technology. It was about character, about making impossible decisions under unthinkable pressure, about carrying responsibility that would stay with you forever. Colonel Reeves, observing this informal mentorship from afar, made a decision that would formalize what was already happening organically. She approached Sal one evening, as he was finishing his shift. "Staff Sergeant," she said respectfully, "I'd like to make you an offer. The Marine Corps would like to create a position for you as a historical advisor and mentor for our advanced training programs. Full civilian contractor status, proper compensation, official recognition of your service." Sal considered the offer while putting away his cleaning supply. "Colonel, I appreciate the thought, but I like the work I'm doing now. These floors don't clean themselves, and somebody needs to do it right." He paused, looking around the facility that had become more than just a workplace. "Besides, the best teaching happens when nobody's watching. When it's just one Marine talking to another, sharing what they've learned so maybe the next person doesn't have to learn it the hard way." Colonel Reeves nodded, understanding that wisdom couldn't be institutionalized. It could only be passed from one generation to the next through genuine relationships built on mutual respect. The facility's floors continued to gleam under Sal's careful attention, but now they also served as gathering places where young warriors learned lessons that no classroom could provide. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, the Marine Corps training facility had become something unique in military education. While other bases focused purely on physical and tactical training, this facility had developed a culture of historical awareness and ethical leadership that set it apart. The change wasn't immediately visible to outside observers. The training was still brutal, the standards still impossibly high, the physical demands still extreme. But the Marines who graduated from this program carried something different with them, an understanding of their place in a larger continuum of service and sacrifice. Brady, who had completed his recycled training and earned his place back in force reconnaissance, had become an informal ambassador for this new culture. As a team leader now, he made sure every Marine under his command understood not just how to fight but why they fought and what traditions they were inheriting. "Before we start today's training," he would tell new arrivals, "I want you to understand, this facility has been cleaned and maintained for the past 15 years by a man who helped write the book on everything we're about to teach you. His name is Staff Sergeant DiMarco, and if you're smart, you'll listen when he talks." The stories of Sal's Vietnam service had spread throughout the Marine Corps, but always with the kind of respectful discretion that kept classified details protected while honoring the essential truths of courage and sacrifice. Young Marines across the country began to understand that heroism often wore work clothes and carried a mop. General Stone, who had initiated the dramatic revelation that day, visited the facility regularly to observe what he privately called the most important military education innovation in decades. "What we've discovered," he explained to visiting Pentagon officials, is that technical competence without historical context and ethical foundation creates dangerous operators. This program produces not just warriors, but leaders who understand the full weight of their responsibility. The success of the program led to its expansion to other training facilities, but none quite captured the unique atmosphere of the original. That special culture could only exist where it had grown organically, around one man's quiet dedication to doing important work without seeking recognition. Sal, now 80, continued his daily routine with the same methodical precision he had always shown. The difference was that his work was no longer invisible. Every spotless floor, every perfectly maintained facility, every moment of patient conversation with a young Marine was recognized as part of a larger mission. On quiet evenings, when the facility was empty except for security personnel, Sal would sometimes pause in his work and remember the valley in Vietnam where 4 young Marines had held off overwhelming odds. 3 of them had died there, but their sacrifice had continued to serve the Corps through the lessons he shared with each new generation. The fragment of metal on his collar had become more than a personal reminder. It was a bridge connecting the past to the future, ensuring that the courage of dead Marines would live on in the hearts of living ones. 2 years after the confrontation that revealed his true identity, Sal DiMarco sat on a bench outside the training facility, watching the sun set over the bay. At 81, he had settled into a routine that brought him deep satisfaction, meaningful work, respected colleagues, and the knowledge that his service continued to matter. A young Marine approached hesitantly, one of the newest recruits barely out of boot camp. Staff Sergeant DiMarco. "I'm Private Rodriguez. I just wanted to thank you for what you told us about leadership last week." Sal looked up at the earnest young face and smiled. "What did I tell you, son? You said that real leaders don't create followers, they create more leaders." "That stuck with me." "Good," Sal replied simply. "Remember it when you're in charge of other Marines someday." After the young man left, Sal reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from invisible janitor to unofficial mentor. He had never sought recognition or acclaim, but life had a way of putting people where they were needed most. A car pulled into the parking area. Brady, now a gunnery sergeant, coming by for one of their regular evening conversations. These talks had become important to both men, bridging the gap between generations and sharing wisdom that couldn't be found in any manual. "How was training today?" Sal asked, as Brady settled onto the bench beside him. "Hard," Brady replied honestly. "We lost 2 candidates to the psychological evaluation. They had all the physical tools, but they couldn't handle the pressure without taking it out on their teammates." "That's the most important lesson they could learn," Sal observed. "Better to discover that here than in combat." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Marines finish their evening runs in the distance. Finally, Brady spoke again. "Staff Sergeant, do you ever regret it? Staying invisible for all those years, you could have had recognition, benefits, Sal considered the question carefully. "Son, I had something better than recognition. I had purpose. Every day I came to work I was serving Marines who were preparing to serve their country. That mattered more than any medal or ceremony." He gestured toward the facility behind. "Recognition is nice, but service is what counts." These floors needed to be cleaned whether anybody noticed or not. Those young Marines needed guidance whether they knew it or not. The work was always important. It just took time for other people to see it. As darkness settled over the base, Sal prepared to head home to his small apartment. The facility would be here tomorrow, along with new Marines to train, new stories to share, and new lessons to teach. The fragment of metal on his collar caught the last rays of sunlight, a small piece of an old war that continued to serve in a new century. Sometimes, Sal reflected, the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple determination to serve something larger than yourself, one day at a time. The warriors who walked these halls would carry his lessons with them around the world, ensuring that the values learned on a bloody hillside in Vietnam would continue to guide Marines who hadn't even been born when those lessons were written in sacrifice and blood.